Thunder cracked across the darkened Memphis sky as sheets of rain pounded against Sarah's living room window. At 26, she had weathered many storms in her cozy suburban home, but something about this evening felt different. The weather alert on her phone had warned of a severe system moving through, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this night would bring more than just wind and rain. As she settled onto her worn leather couch with a steaming cup of chamomile tea, a frantic knocking at her front door made her nearly spill the hot liquid. Her heart raced as she approached the peephole, the pounding growing more desperate with each passing second. Through the distorted lens, she could make out a drenched figure hunched against the elements. Against everything her mother had taught her about opening doors to strangers, something in her gut told her this was different. She found herself face to face with a middle-aged white man, completely soaked and shivering, his car apparently broken down just around the corner. In that moment, Sarah saw past their obvious differences. She simply saw someone in need. "Please," he managed through chattering teeth, "I just need to call for help. My phone died, and no other houses had their lights on." His eyes carried a mix of desperation and embarrassment, hands trembling as he hugged himself against the cold. What happened next would change both their lives forever, though neither of them could have predicted it. As Sarah welcomed him into her home, she noticed he walked with a slight limp, his business suit now completely ruined by the storm. While he dried off with a towel she provided, his eyes caught something on her mantel that made him freeze. It was an old photograph, yellowed with age, showing Sarah's grandmother standing proudly in front of Memphis Central Hospital in 1963. The man's hands shook as he picked up the frame, tears welling in his eyes. "This woman," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know this woman." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Her grandmother, a pioneering nurse who broke racial barriers in the segregated South, had passed away just last year. The stories she'd shared of those challenging times had shaped Sarah's worldview, teaching her to judge people by their character rather than their appearance. The stranger turned to her, still clutching the photograph, his face a canvas of disbelief and wonder. "Your grandmother," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "She saved my father's life." He paused, collecting himself as memories seemed to wash over him like the storm outside. "I've been searching for her family for 40 years, trying to repay a debt that can never truly be repaid." As lightning illuminated the room in bright flashes, Sarah stood transfixed. Here was this man, who by chance or fate had sought shelter from a storm, holding a piece of her family's history in his trembling hands. The coincidence seemed too perfect, too orchestrated to be real. But before he could explain further, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. In that moment, as thunder shook the house's foundation, Sarah realized this chance encounter was about to reveal a story that would bridge generations, heal old wounds, and remind us all that sometimes the most powerful connections are forged in the most unexpected moments. What happened next would not only change their lives but would touch hearts across the nation, proving that even in our divided times, humanity's capacity for kindness, gratitude, and connection knows no boundaries. In the darkness, Sarah fumbled for her phone's flashlight, its beam casting long shadows across her living room walls. The stranger, who had introduced himself as David Thompson, sat quietly, still holding her grandmother's photograph. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside, a different kind of tension filled the air. "Would you like some hot coffee while we wait for the power to come back?" Sarah offered, trying to process this surreal moment. David nodded gratefully, finally setting down the precious photograph. As she moved around her kitchen with practiced ease, she could hear him clearing his throat, preparing to share a story she sensed would change everything. It was Christmas Eve, 1962. David began as Sarah returned with 2 steaming mugs. "My father was driving home from his late shift at the factory when he had a massive heart attack. The closest hospital was Memphis Central, but," he paused, the weight of history hanging heavy in his words, "well, you know how things were back then." Sarah nodded solemnly. Her grandmother had told her countless stories about those days, the separate entrances, the segregated wards, the countless lives lost to prejudice disguised as policy. But her grandmother, Rose Mitchell, had been different. She'd fought those barriers one patient at a time, one small act of courage after another. Your grandmother was working the emergency ward that night, David continued, his hands wrapped tightly around the warm mug. When my father was brought in, other staff members hesitated, citing hospital policies. But Rose, his voice cracked with emotion, she stepped forward without hesitation. She didn't see a white man in distress. She just saw someone's father dying on Christmas Eve. Lightning flashed again, illuminating tears on David's cheeks. Sarah felt her own eyes welling up, remembering her grandmother's quiet strength, her unwavering belief that love could bridge any divide. The power flickered briefly but remained out, as if the universe itself wanted this story told in intimate darkness. She stayed with him all night, monitoring his condition, fighting against both the illness and the system itself. When others suggested moving him to a more appropriate facility, she stood her ground. "Not on my watch," she said. "Not on Christmas." David's voice filled with admiration as he recounted the details his father had shared with him countless times. Sarah sank deeper into her chair, memories of her own flooding back. How many times had she heard her grandmother say those exact words? "Not on my watch." It had been her battle cry, her reminder that sometimes doing the right thing meant standing alone. "My father lived another 20 years because of your grandmother," David said softly. "He made me promise to find her, to thank her family if he couldn't thank her himself. I've been searching for so long, but with only her first name and an old hospital badge number." He shook his head, still amazed at the circumstance that had led him to Sarah's door. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but neither of them noticed any more. They were lost in the connection forming between them, a bridge built by one woman's courage decades ago. Sarah opened her mouth to share her own memories of her grandmother when a loud crash from outside made them both jump. Through the window, they could see a large tree branch had fallen across David's stranded car, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. But there was something else out there too, something that would make this night even more extraordinary than either of them could have imagined. As Sarah moved to get a better look at the damage, she noticed an old leather briefcase among David's belongings, its worn surface bearing a familiar symbol, one that would unlock another layer of this remarkable story. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the symbol on David's briefcase, a distinctive medical caduceus intertwined with a rose, the exact same design she'd seen countless times in her grandmother's old journals. Her hands trembled as she pointed to it. That symbol. "Where did you get that briefcase?" David's eyes widened as he followed her gaze. "This was my father's. He worked as a medical supplies distributor in the 60s. He reached for the briefcase with unsteady hands, his coffee forgotten. But there's something else you need to see." The brass clasps clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the storm-filled silence. Inside, wrapped carefully in aged tissue paper, lay a stack of yellowed envelopes bound together with a faded blue ribbon. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she saw the handwriting. She'd recognize her grandmother's elegant script anywhere. But these weren't just any letters. They were dated throughout 1963, each addressed to the hospital board. "After my father's recovery," David explained, his voice thick with emotion, "your grandmother didn't just go back to her regular duties. She began a quiet revolution within those hospital walls." He carefully removed the first letter, handling it as if it were made of glass. "She documented everything. Every patient turned away, every life-saving treatment delayed because of segregation policies." Thunder rolled overhead as Sarah sank back into her chair, her mind spinning. Her grandmother had never mentioned these letters, never spoke of this part of her story. Yet here was proof of a deeper, more profound courage than she'd ever known. As David began to read excerpts from the letters, another crash of lightning illuminated the room, and through the window, Sarah noticed something alarming. The fallen tree branch hadn't just damaged David's car. It had knocked over a power line, which now sparked dangerously close to a growing puddle of water. But before she could voice her concern, David pulled out something else from the briefcase, a newspaper clipping dated just weeks before the hospital finally desegregated. The headline made her gasp. "Anonymous donor threatens to withdraw $1 million hospital funding." Below it, in her grandmother's handwriting, were the words, "Sometimes love requires sacrifice." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as the pieces started falling into place. The timing of the hospital's desegregation, her grandmother's sudden career change that same year, and the mysterious disappearance of her grandfather's successful business. It all pointed to an incredible truth. Just then, the sparking power line outside cast an eerie glow through the window, illuminating David's face as he pulled out one final document from the briefcase. It was a canceled check, dated 1963, signed by his father's company, but with a familiar name listed as the account holder, Sarah's grandfather. Before either of them could process this revelation, a blinding flash lit up the night sky, followed by a deafening crack. The sparking power line had finally given way, whipping dangerous across Sarah's front yard. And there, caught in its deadly dance, was something that would force them both to make a choice that would echo their grandparents' courage from so many years ago. Through the rain-streaked window, Sarah spotted an elderly woman in a wheelchair, stranded on the sidewalk, her caregiver frantically trying to push her to safety as the live wire thrashed dangerously close to them. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her rain jacket, but David caught her arm. "You can't go out there. It's too dangerous." His eyes reflected the same fear his father must have felt that long ago Christmas Eve. "Not on my watch," Sarah replied, echoing her grandmother's words with fierce determination. The storm raged louder, but she was already moving, David limping quickly behind her despite his earlier injury. The wind whipped the letters from his briefcase across the room, scattering them like autumn leaves, but neither of them looked back. As they reached the front door, David pulled something else from his pocket, a small velvet box that had been hidden in a secret compartment of the briefcase. "Your grandmother left this with my father," he shouted over the howling wind. "She said to return it only when the true meaning of her sacrifice was understood." But before he could open it, a desperate cry cut through the storm. The caregiver had slipped in the mud, and the elderly woman's wheelchair was rolling backward toward the sparking power line. Sarah sprinted forward, her feet splashing through puddles, her heart pounding with the same rhythm as the thunder overhead. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. The elderly woman turned her face toward Sarah, and through the curtain of rain, Sarah recognized features she'd seen in old photographs. This was Mrs. Henderson, the former head nurse who had initially opposed her grandmother's efforts to treat David's father, the very woman who had later become one of her grandmother's strongest allies in fighting for hospital integration. David had reached the caregiver, helping her to her feet, while Sarah lunged for the wheelchair just as another lightning bolt illuminated the scene. The live wire crackled and snapped behind them, and Sarah could feel its deadly energy buzzing through the air. But something else caught her eye, a glint of metal around Mrs. Henderson's neck. It was a pendant, identical to the symbol on David's briefcase. Mrs. Henderson clutched Sarah's hand as they rushed back toward the house, her eyes filled with recognition and tears. "I knew Rose would find a way," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Even after all these years, she's still bringing us together." Once safely inside, Mrs. Henderson revealed that she had been on her way to Sarah's house deliberately, carrying documents of her own, records that would complete the story of what really happened in 1963. But as she reached for her bag, the power line outside exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the neighborhood into total darkness. In the beam of Sarah's flashlight, David's hands trembled as he finally opened the velvet box. Inside lay a single key, its brass surface etched with words that made Sarah's heart stop. "Memphis Central Hospital, Records Room B." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened in recognition, and she pressed her hand to her heart. "So it still exists," she breathed, "the proof we could never find." But before anyone could speak another word, Sarah's phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end delivered news that would reshape everything they thought they knew about that fateful night in 1963 and reveal why this storm had brought them together in ways none of them could have imagined. To be continued. The unfamiliar voice on the phone belonged to a security guard at Memphis Central Hospital. "Ma'am, I apologize for calling so late, but there's been a flood in the basement archives. We found your grandmother's name and number on some old documents. The water's rising, and there's something you need to see tonight." Sarah looked at David and Mrs. Henderson, their faces illuminated by lightning flashes. Without a word, they knew what they had to do. The storm that had brought them together was now threatening to wash away the final pieces of their shared history. "My caregiver can take us in my van," Mrs. Henderson offered, her voice stronger now. "We have to preserve what's left." The key in the velvet box suddenly felt heavy in Sarah's pocket, its purpose clear. As they carefully made their way to the vehicle, the fallen power line had been safely cordoned off by emergency crews arriving in the neighborhood. During the tense drive to the hospital, Mrs. Henderson revealed that she and Rose had hidden a complete record of their fight for integration, proof that would fill in all the gaps. "Your grandfather's donation wasn't just money," she explained to Sarah. "He sold his business to create a trust, ensuring the hospital would never again turn away patients based on race. But there was more to the story, so much more." They arrived at the hospital to find maintenance crews pumping water from the basement. The security guard led them to Records Room B, where the key fit perfectly into a rusted filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in decades. Inside, protected in waterproof containers, they found photographs, medical records, and a leather-bound journal. As Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands, a letter fell out, addressed to her in her grandmother's handwriting. "My dearest granddaughter, if you're reading this, then the storm has finally come. You see, every great change requires a storm, a force of nature that breaks down old barriers and washes away the walls we build between us." David gasped as he read over her shoulder. The journal revealed that his father and Sarah's grandfather had been childhood friends, separated by segregation, but reunited that Christmas Eve through Rose's courage. The $1 million donation hadn't come from one family, but from both families pooling everything they had. Mrs. Henderson wiped tears from her eyes as she added the final piece. "Your grandmother and I didn't just integrate the hospital, dear. We created a secret network of nurses and doctors across the South, all connected by that symbol on the briefcase. We called ourselves the Rose Network, helping anyone who needed care, regardless of who they were." But the most extraordinary revelation came from the last page of the journal. Rose had known this day would come. She predicted that someday a storm would bring her granddaughter and David together. The final entry, dated just weeks before her passing, read, "The greatest legacy we can leave is not in the walls we break down, but in the bridges we build. Sarah, my dear, you'll know what to do with this truth." As if on cue, the hospital's backup generators hummed to life, flooding the room with light. There, on the wall behind the filing cabinet, hidden for decades, was a mural. It showed hands of different colors clasped together around a rose, with a simple inscription, "Not on our watch. Never again." Sarah turned to share this moment with David and Mrs. Henderson, only to find them staring at her phone. Breaking news was flashing across the screen. The hospital board had just announced plans to demolish the old wing, including Records Room B, to make way for modernization. They had less than 48 hours to preserve not just documents, but a legacy that had waited half a century to be revealed. In that dimly lit basement, surrounded by history and heritage, Sarah knew exactly what her grandmother had meant about knowing what to do. She pulled out her phone and started documenting everything. Every photograph, every document, every piece of evidence that told the story of courage, unity, and change. David and Mrs. Henderson joined in, their phones' flashes illuminating decades of hidden history. As they worked through the night, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. The Rose Network hadn't just saved lives, it had changed them. There were letters from families across the South, thanking the anonymous heroes who had helped them in their darkest hours. Each story was a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, humanity over hatred. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a cleaned and renewed world. Sarah's social media posts about the discovery had gone viral, drawing the attention of local news stations and civil rights historians. But more importantly, it caught the eye of the hospital board chairman's granddaughter, who immediately called for an emergency meeting. 2 days later, instead of demolition crews, a team of historical preservationists arrived at Records Room B. The hospital board didn't just decide to preserve the room. They voted to transform the entire old wing into a civil rights medical history museum, with the Rose Network's story at its heart. The mural would remain exactly where it had waited all those years, a testament to those who fought quietly but powerfully for change. Mrs. Henderson, her voice strong with purpose, became the museum's first oral historian, sharing stories that had waited decades to be told. David, discovering his true calling, left his corporate job to manage the museum's development, ensuring that future generations would understand the price and importance of compassion. As for Sarah, she found her grandmother's prediction coming true in unexpected ways. The story of that stormy night and its discoveries inspired a new generation of healthcare workers. Hospitals across the country began reaching out, sharing their own hidden histories of heroes who had fought for equality in medicine. 1 month after the storm, Sarah stood in the newly opened museum, watching visitors move through the exhibits with tears and smiles. The Rose Network symbol had been incorporated into the museum's logo, a reminder that real change often grows from small acts of courage. David joined her, now walking without a limp, carrying a familiar leather briefcase filled with new stories waiting to be shared. "You know," he said softly, "our grandparents never got to see their dream fully realized, but they knew someday, somehow, the right people would come together to finish what they started." Sarah smiled, touching the pendant she now wore, a replica of the Rose Network symbol, created to honor all those who had been part of the original movement. "Not on our watch," she replied, has become not just a phrase from the past, but a promise to the future. As the sun set outside the hospital windows, casting a warm glow through the preserved Records Room B, Sarah realized that some storms come not to destroy, but to reveal what has been hidden, to wash away the old and make room for new growth. Her grandmother had known that the most powerful changes often begin with a simple choice: to open a door during a storm, to help a stranger in need, to stand up for what's right when it would be easier to look away. The story of that stormy night continues to inspire others, reminding us that the most extraordinary discoveries often come from ordinary moments of choosing kindness over fear. And somewhere, Sarah likes to think, her grandmother is smiling, knowing that her faith in the power of human connection was justified, one storm, one choice, one heart at a time.